In this episode of the podcast, we're going to kind of go back and retread just a little bit of ground we covered from the previous chapter, chapter 4. This particular figure is 5.4. This is 172 in chapter 5. And we're talking about system software, utility programs, file management, etc. I had indicated that, and this was true, and this is true of a certain kind of scope, and I knew we were going to get here this chapter, so I was perfectly happy to squint at kind of the overall truth of the statement there. Is I had mentioned that the text makes this really robust distinction between application software and operating system software. And for you and for me, even if you delve into a career in, something computer sciencey, right? So if you do hardware support or if you do software support or anything else, that distinction is kind of unnecessary. So again, this is 5.4 on page 172 in chapter 5. And really the operating system is something that you don't touch. We'll talk about system software, which makes it feel like you touch the operating system. But really at its very core, the OS, that's the operating system, does not need you in any way, shape, or form to exist. The operating system is right here in the middle. And it manages all of the disparate components that a computer really needs for you to be able to interact with it. So at the very top, it manages hardware, peripherals, or non-peripheral hardware. So like the fan that's baked into the computer, that's the operating system that has to manage that. If you have any one of a number of interfaces on there, so if there's voice input, if you have that, that's something that the operating system has to manage. Next, moving over here clockwise, it provides a way for the CPU, and again, that's the central processing unit, and the software to interact. So software has to run constantly in the background. So even if, let's pretend you're in Word, or here, this is an application called Bookshelf. Even if I'm not touching this is on my iPad right now, if I'm not touching the iPad, if I'm talking into the microphone, I need something to continue to allow Bookshelf, again, that's the application here, to run. And that's what the operating system does. It manages any of the processors that we would have. So remember, there's a host of processing devices in any and all of our computers. So if we're, here on an iPad, it has the central processor. That could be comprised of smaller processors. There's a mathematics, an ALU, that's arithmetic and logic unit. There are graphics processors. There are neural engines. There's a ton of processing that's happening in the background. And at its core, it's the operating system that's doing that for us. It also manages memory and storage. So that's exactly what it sounds like. Memory is temporary storage, where temporary actions are kind of set aside so that things run faster. Long-term storage is where you keep all your stuff when you turn things off, or where your photos and your music and things are stored when you're not using them. And finally, it provides a user interface, and that's part of it. Really what an operating system does is allow you to interact with user and system software, and we'll talk about that coming up next. So to start off with, and not just because it's the device I literally had in my hand, but because I think the scope of something like a phone or an iPad seems like it's more limited. And again, an iPad now can be nearly as powerful as like an Ultrabook would be. So just because it's an iPad, just because we refer to them as apps instead of applications, just because we don't think we interact with things like files and folders as much, doesn't mean that it's not as fully fledged a computer as a desktop is, and that's what we'll take a look at a little bit later on. So here, even with an iPad, we have system software and we have an operating system. So the operating system is everything happening in the background. So the operating system allows me to flick back and forth and get through here. The operating system is what manages, all of the icons on my desktop there. The operating system manages, when is it that a system noise would beep or anything along those lines. But even here we have software that allows us to interact with the operating system, in that we would refer to as system software. So if I tap on, it's right here, the settings. This is an application. Settings is an app. It's something we can update. It's something we can change. It's not something that's permanent. And even here, each one of these different settings in the settings app really kind of represents an application itself. So if I was to come in here and change any of these things, the date and time, this is part of the date and time systems application. If I was to come in here for, battery is really part of the system, but it's an application that allows me to interact with the operating system. So these are systems applications. Excuse me. These are systems applications, but we're just not used to thinking of an iPad in that. So I don't have on me a Windows PC, and I thought that the example here would be best, because more of you guys would have a Windows PC than a Mac, is we have, in the Windows environment, we have a host of these system softwares that allow us to interact with the operating system, but are not, in fact, the operating system. Here, this is figure 5.9, and this is on page 176 here in chapter 5. Some of you might be familiar with the Device Manager. Device Manager is an application. It's a systems application that allows us to interact. It feels like it allows us to interact, but really what it does is it provides an intermediary for us to interact with the operating system. Here, just in this little screenshot we have, again, this is 5.9, we can interact with individual drivers, we can interact with the display, we can change settings, we can do things like that. This is what system software allows us to do. It's like it's a middleman. It allows us to request changes from our operating system, and then the operating system can go through and make that requested change if that's something it can do. Now, you'll notice I was a little bit hesitant there to say make that change, full stop. Sometimes there are reasons that, here I'm looking at, again, the Device Manager in Windows. Sometimes there are reasons that the operating system thinks and knows it's in its best interest to ignore some of our requests. So, for example, in an operating system, we cannot simply format the main drive. So if you were to, in Windows, go to the Disk Manager, right-click the C drive. C drive is usually where we have our operating system stored, and say Format. Now, you're the user. You own the PC. It is your decision, theoretically, whether or not you want to do something as permanent and destructive as format the drive where the operating system is located, where all of your files are located, where all of your music and images are located. And we think that the operating system should say, all right, you're the boss, and go ahead and delete itself. This is in no way, shape, or form what happens, right? So when you select format the drive, Windows gives you an error message that says Windows cannot format drive, and it'll return to you an error that says system drive located here, something to that effect. Same goes on a Mac or a Linux machine. I can partition drives. I can do a lot of different things with those utilities, but what I cannot do is change the main operating system drive's partition to be smaller than it requires right now. What I cannot do is delete or format that partition where the operating system is running from right now. So most system software allows you to interact with the non-destructive portions of the settings that you can change, but it in no way, shape, or form allows you to do everything, because even a user like me who has spent better than a decade at a high level interacting with PCs in a mass scale, right? So thousands of PCs are under my watch. Even then, when I go through and do a lot of the really detailed under the hood work with batches of PCs, there are only so many things that I'm allowed as an administrator to do. And system software allows us to do that. But system utility software rather allows us to do that. But even as a high-level admin, there's a limit to how destructive it is that you can be, and it turns out that works in all of our favors.